Good evening and welcome. I'm Tom Putnam, Director of the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum, and on behalf of Heather Campion, CEO of the Kennedy Library Foundation, and all of my library and foundation colleagues, I thank you for coming and acknowledge the generous underwriters of the Kennedy Library Forum's lead sponsor, Bank of America, Raytheon, Boston Capital, the Lowell Institute, the Boston Foundation, and our media partners, the Boston Globe, Xfinity, Viacom, and WBUR. In the presidential campaign of 1960, John F. Kennedy reminded voters that he was not the Catholic candidate running for president, but the Democratic candidate who happened to be Catholic. In an address to a group of Protestant ministers in Houston, he made firm his belief in the separation of church and state. Yet religion continued to play a role in that campaign and in the decision of some voters, and JFK's election is seen as a watershed for this nation and for the Catholic Church, which was itself going through its own transformation during the decade of the 1960s. Those changes were in tune with the times, just as the selection of Pope John Paul II was later seen as a catalyst for political change, not only in his native Poland, but throughout the Soviet bloc. And his papacy had its own effect on the trajectory of the church in this new century. We gather this evening to discuss a new pope, Francis, the first to hail from South America, who's offering a new tone and message to his flock and to the world. The question we pose tonight is what that means in a political context, both in this country and throughout the globe. We first considered such a forum last year at this time when reading James Carroll's thoughtful article in the New Yorker magazine. Mr. Carroll is an author of 11 novels and 7 works of nonfiction, including Christ Actually, the Son of God in a Secular Age. He's also a columnist for the Boston Globe, a scholar in residence at Suffolk University, and a frequent visitor to this stage. His insightful New Yorker article was paired with a delightful piece of cover artwork, and I thought it might be appropriate to have this whimsical view of Francis presiding over the opening of tonight's proceedings, especially fitting on this first day of snow. Few have been more successful in coupling matters of politics and faith than Sister Simone Campbell, the leader of the Nuns on the Bus advocacy effort to advance the cause of social justice, promote immigration reform, and protest cuts to programs which aid the poor. In her memoir, A Nun on the Bus, which along with Mr. Carroll's new book is on sale in our store, she writes that when considering the name of their movement, she and her fellow sisters considered but rejected the name Nuns on the Run, as that might connote that they were running away from rather than standing up for their political and spiritual beliefs. She just told me now that she was a Kennedy girl in the 1960 campaign and actually attended the Democratic convention in the Los Angeles Coliseum with her mother and sister to hear JFK give his New Frontier speech. Neil Swidey is an author and reporter for the Boston Globe who also wrote an extensive and thoughtful article about Pope Francis in the Globe Sunday magazine, in which he discussed his own Catholic upbringing in Somerset and Fall River. The essay examined this emerging papacy within a more local and regional context. Through it, Mr. Swidey provided a glimpse into his own family upbringing with images of his father working at the local church food pantry, which also allows me to note that he has the distinction in the 35-year history of the Kennedy Library Forum series to be the only panelist whose mother not only attends to hear him speak, but bakes cookies for us to enjoy after the event is over. She's here in the front row, and we've already sampled some of her fare. Mary Gordon is an award-winning author of 7 novels, 6 works of nonfiction, and 3 collections of fiction. She is also a professor at Barnard College. This summer, I took her most recent collection on vacation, hoping to take a breather from all things Kennedy, only to discover in the title novella, The Liar's Wife, that the tragic events of 1963 serve as a backdrop and turning point for the story's main characters. If JFK was not the Catholic candidate years ago, she is not a Catholic writer, though Catholicism imbues many of her works. Our moderator this evening is Marjorie Egan, a talk radio host on WGBH, a former reporter and columnist for the Boston Herald, who currently writes for the Boston Globe's website Crux, focusing on issues related to Catholics, politics, and the church. As I conclude my introduction and we remove this image of Pope Francis, I suppose the question that is most on our minds is just how deep an impression this new Pope, this smiling snow angel, can make on his followers, on this nation, and on our world. To explore this topic, please join me in welcoming Sister Simone Campbell, James Carroll, Marjorie Egan, Mary Gordon, and Neil Swidey to the Kennedy Library.
For being here tonight. And before we start, just a couple of updates on the Pope in case you've missed them. I don't know if you all knew that the Pope has declared in the last few days that all dogs are going to heaven. That it's and cats and horses and guinea pigs and everything else. Apparently all animals are going to go to heaven, he declared just a few days ago. I thought that was great, and I hope he was infallible when he made that declaration. So we can all meet up with Rover if we behave ourselves. And the other thing that just was reported today by the Washington Post is a new Pew survey about the Pope's popularity around the world. In Europe, it's at 84% approval. United States, 78%. Latin America, 72%. He's less popular in Muslim nations where Christians are not always welcomed. But the popularity of this man is just extraordinary. And I think he's brought huge excitement to the church, which everybody here has talked about. But I wanted to start with what we hope for this, for his papacy. And Mary Gordon, you've talked about hope for grown-ups, and I heard you in an interview talking about how when you first read the article in the Jesuit magazine that talked about how that the church had emphasized too much the so-called sex issues, gay marriage and contraception and abortion and all that he wanted to move away from that constant look at that you burst into tears. So what is your hope for all these books you've written that have so closely followed your own Catholicism?
Well, as a novelist, and Jim's a novelist and Sister Simone is a poet, so I think, we're all writers in good company. I think what he's done is changed the tone, and I would be hard-pressed to say that tone doesn't matter. He's stopped the punitive tone of Benedict and John Paul II. I think people give John Paul II more of a pass than, to my mind, he deserves. He was actually extremely punitive, as was Benedict. And so I think the most important thing that he's done is to create a climate that is more of an embrace. And that opens a door. Now, what that door is going to open to, I'm not quite sure, because I find him extremely hard to read. He says many things that make me very hopeful, which is that my hope for the church is that it will deal with the reality of what it is to be alive now, rather than a fantasy or a symbol of the past. And I think at least he opens the door to that. What is on the other side of the door, I don't know. I have to believe in hope against hope that this institution is capable of change. I'm not completely sure that it is. But I think what he's done is created a possibility where there was a climate of punishment. And I think he's undone the tonality of punishment, and at least that's an opening.
You were nodding your head, Sister. The report about the women religious is coming out on Tuesday.
Oh, yes,
so
there's that.
I don't know. We'll wait and see about we'll wait and see how punishing that is. But you were nodding your head when Mary was talking about this tone of punishment going away.
Yes, and I think his approach of openness and welcoming diverse thought is a huge step forward. And my hunch is he just sees the doorway and is inviting people in. He has less of an agenda for a doctrinaire approach. And in Joy of the Gospel, which he wrote a year ago, which is this fabulous document that I just loved, that I brought just in case I needed it, but he says that there are 4 steps to peace building. And I think he's trying to build peace in the church. Because what he says first is that time is more important than space, that having dialogue is more important than protecting my turf. And that's what he's doing. And then he says that unity triumphs over conflict. People get tired of conflicting, having the conflict, having the fight. People get tired of it, and he's welcoming people in. But the third one I think is most important, where he says realities are more important than ideas. And what he says he means is everyone's story is more valuable than any of the intellectual theories that I have. And so he is trying to build peace with dialogue, with engagement, and hearing everyone's story without having his turf be the defining space. And that is a huge, huge difference.
But how does that translate, everyone's story and reality, as opposed to just ideas? What is that? You know, you've talked about this too. The tone has changed. He's more of a Christ-like figure almost, with the washing of the feet and so forth that he did in that prison after he became pope. But what is the new reality? What does that mean, realities?
Well, the thing that I find most moving about him is that he isn't impressing us with what he's saying. I agree with you. The Joy of the Gospel is an absolutely elegant and powerful statement of faith and invitation to faith. But it's not the most important thing, actually, even that elegant statement. The most important thing is the way he acts.
Yeah,
I think. And the word that comes to mind for me about the way he acts is, and I wouldn't have used this about popes. I can think of one pope I would have used it about, Pope John, but the word that comes to mind is kindness. Mm-hmm. It seems a little shocking, actually, to be enthralled with a pope
Christian
for manifesting kindness. But there it is. And here's an example. In the Italian press, upon his election, and you may know this, there was a widely circulated and widely enjoyed report that when he was announced as pope and came out of the Sistine Chapel and was about to go out into the balcony, he was being ushered into his new costume, his white robes and shoes. You know that he declined the shoes, but the story in the Italian press said that the attendant was standing there with the ermine cape, symbol of the papacy, going back to the Renaissance. And he turned to the man and said, "The circus is over." Now, here's the thing. He never said that. That was in the press. God bless, forbid we should ever do such a thing. It was in the press. It wasn't fact-checked. There was a kind of great enjoyment of it because it was a quip. It was a kind of symbol of the new day, quickly, but it was cruel. It was a put-down on the attendant. He would never have done that, and he didn't do it. I'm sure he just politely declined the cape, and I'll bet he said thank you. And to me, that's enormously important. And I think it's part of the complaints some restless liberals have about him is he's not going fast enough, or he's not addressing more directly the situation of women in the church. He seems neutral or opposed even to the idea of ordaining women to the priesthood. What's going on with this? My own sense of it is, number one, Benedict is alive, and he's profoundly respectful of Benedict's position, which I find admirable, even though I myself am not an admirer of much of what Benedict represented for the church. But I sense in this man a determination, above all, not to embarrass or humiliate Pope Benedict. And the women's issue, Pope Benedict declared as Ratzinger that the church's teaching on the ordination of women was infallible. I mean, dug the hole right down to the bottom of the abyss, you know? Infallible teaching, excuse me. And people, even in the Curia, wanted that to go away, because I don't think nobody, in fact, there was a commission of the Vatican itself that said the exact opposite. There's no doctrinal reason to oppose the ordination of women. So Pope Francis is kind, and he's clearly very kind to his predecessor, which I find admirable. And if he weren't kind to him, why would we take seriously his being kind to the people around who are easy to be kind to?
Well, Neil, get in here. You in your piece, which was a great piece, you grew up in Somerset, I grew up in Fall River, so were your neighbors growing up. You talked about your parents as being kind of critical Catholics. I guess that was what he called Mom out here, who made the cookies tonight. But that the image of your father, you know, the social justice piece, working in the food pantry and all that kind of stuff. If he's kind and he has changed the tone, which I think everybody more or less agrees he has, but nothing changes in terms of women or in terms of divorced and remarried Catholics or gays. Where do those critical Catholics, you talk about in your piece about the numbers in Boston, which is a pretty Catholic place, just plummeting. Mm-hmm. What happens?
Well, I think what I look at with Francis is this extraordinary combination of charisma and calculus. I really do think he's a brilliant politician because John Paul had the charisma, but he had rigidity. That was his failing. He sort of couldn't, and maybe that served him well dealing with Soviet thugs, you know, in his upbringing, but it held back the church at a critical time. And I think, you know, if you think about, it's hard to imagine any institution in the Western Hemisphere that is more allergic to reform than the Vatican, right? And so he has to use that power carefully and strategically, and he's done it by going first with the charisma. I think we sort of know that, but I do feel, and I do think that there is an agenda to use that for good. I think he's an older gentleman. He knows, when we look at transformational figures and popes, John the 23rd comes to mind, who was only pope for 5 years, and he was dead before I was born, but all I heard about growing up was John Paul. My dad was a huge hero of my dad's, because he used his time as pope for good to outlast him, and I think that's what others have failed to do. So the first thing he's done is, for a lot of people probably in this room, here in Boston and around the world, who were Catholics, who saw the outrage and the scourge of the clergy abuse, sex abuse crisis, and yet stayed as Catholics, went back to Mass. That took an enormous amount of cognitive dissonance for people to do that, to step back into Mass, if you're sort of sentient Catholic, to sort of think, this is the institution, this is how profoundly it failed its most vulnerable, the children, and made these sins, but I'm going to go back because there's something important about that. What Francis has done is given those Catholics and many others permission and sort of kind of a billboard for people to explain why they've stayed, that there is hope, that there is someone who believes in the social justice, someone who did turn down the ermine cape and all the other trappings, and not for, I don't think that is for political calculation. I think, like Cardinal O'Malley, I think this is someone who is profoundly uncomfortable with the culture of princes that has ruled the Vatican for so long, the trappings. So if he can turn, and this is where I think the political calculus comes in, if he can turn down those trappings, because being the Pope is the ultimate red line of life, you know, red rope line, if he can say no to those things, then how is some sort of Monsignor in Milwaukee going to say, I need a driver and I need an opulent residence? How is he going to do that? So that's a political as well as a moral decision, I think. So we'll see what happens from there.
But you know, I think another piece of that that's so important to keep in mind is also that he's deeply pastoral and has his own spiritual life. He is not a person who is just doing the rules, and find so much of what leadership has been defined as is doing the rules right and publicly. But what Francis is saying over and over is that it's about the journey. It's about being together, that all are welcome. And yes, it's kindness, but more than kindness, it is openness to welcome in all those who journey together. And that is a pastoral response with spiritual leadership that we have been hungry for. And so some of the Catholics that I've met that are the folks that have been holding on by their fingernails or letting go in great quantities find very touching that spiritual clarity that can admit ambiguity, can admit uncertainty, and talk about his own conversion. Those are huge spiritual leadership qualities that I think get included in your good analysis.
I hate to be the downer.
But go for it, Mary. Go for it. We need it. We need it.
See, I'm partly Sicilian, so.
Oh, bene.
But I'd like to respond to your question. How does all this tonality and charisma and symbolism, which again, as an artist, I would never downplay, but how does it translate to a lived life?
Right.
When people are still being denied communion, if they are divorced, when people are practicing birth control and doing it, being told that it's a sin, when gay people are still told, well, you know, you're still a child of God as long as you don't act out on your desires. And I think when you talk about social justice and questions of poverty, particularly for women, issues of reproductive rights have an enormous impact on the lived lives of women around the world. And one of the things, and sounds like I'm a naysayer, and I'm not, I'm just an yes butter. That one of the things that's happened to me 150 years of being a feminist is what people on the left have often said to us is, your agenda has to wait because first we're going to solve world peace and poverty. And then after we solve that, we'll deal with women's issues. And so women's issues have often, even among progressive men, get put on the back burner, but they're not abstractions. The lived lives of women are enormously affected by issues of reproductive rights. And globally, I think that, and I can sort of understand why he's doing it, which is the yes, but when I think about, if you're talking about the reality of lived lives, all these issues of reproductive rights and sexuality have an enormous impact on daily life. And I'm not sure that he's ever going to address them.
Probably not.
Well, here's what I wonder, because you wrote about this, James Carroll, in Practicing Catholic. You talked about the whole Paul VI moment when there was the encyclical about birth control and how many people thought we were going to have an okay on birth control. Tell people how you recounted that whole situation, which gives me hope that maybe he could do something at least about birth control, but maybe I'm being too much of a Pollyanna, but explain that.
Well, the short of what Marjorie's asking is, how does it come that the Catholic Church has taken such a stern position against birth control? Birth control, after all, especially when we're talking about prophylactics that work or condoms that work. Condoms are relatively modern inventions, and at the time of the reconsideration on birth control, the pill had just been rendered safe for use by women. So in the early 60s, there was a Catholic commission appointed by the Pope to study the question of the Church's position. And an overwhelming majority, dozens and dozens against a handful of that commission, said not only should there be a change, not only should the pill be permitted since it satisfies technical ways around the old prohibition, but the entire prohibition of contraception should be let go of. And the Pope ruled against that vast majority, which included theologians, bishops, and a couple of cardinals. And that is what generated the crisis of conscience in the church, because immediately you had pushback from bishops and priests and theologians, public pushback, and sisters, and the vast population of lay people said no to the church's teaching on this immediately. This was in 1968, the summer of 1968, that insane year when so many things came apart in society. This was the Catholic version of that eruption. And
Why did the Pope vote against all those
Well,
theologians and bishops?
I think it's because the church dug itself into a hole on the question of papal authority in the 19th century with this very confused idea about papal infallibility. And Pope Paul VI, I'm not a mind reader, and he didn't tell me this, but my assumption is he understood that the value of papal authority was at stake because his predecessors had said no to contraception. And so he was afraid of undoing what his predecessors had done for the sake of papal authority. It wasn't for the sake of sexual morality. It wasn't for the sake of basic questions of right and wrong. I don't think it was even for the sake of keeping women in their place, although that was an effect of it. It was for the sake of papal authority. And that's been the curse of the Vatican and the Catholic Church for more than 100 years. And this is why, Mary, I couldn't agree more with you. The assessment you just laid out for us is absolutely right, and it's why we have to be very cautious in our optimism, and especially why we males have to have a major second thought every time we want to put the agenda of women on the back burner. But how do you change an institution that has these commitments and the hole that it dug itself into on the question of authority? How do you actually change it? And if one of the things you're trying to change is the notion that somebody stands on top of the pyramid and gives orders to everybody else in the pyramid, if that's what you're trying to change, you don't stand on top of the pyramid and say, oh, and everybody before me was wrong, and this is how it is now. You engage the institution in a process.
I want to do another yes, but sorry, Jim. But if you look at the people that he invited to the Commission on Family Life, he did not include anybody that was really going to challenge the church's position on birth control. The only lay people from America, for example, that he included were people in the natural family planning movement. And so it seems to me if he were really interested in creating a dialogue on reproductive rights, he would have included people on that commission who would actually challenge him, and he really didn't. So I don't think he's going to fall on that grenade.
I don't think so either. But I think this is the piece where I think we really also have to look at what do we do, because I think it's tempting to put it all on him because he's Pope. And he's supposed to be Pope. And while we don't like this idea of infallibility, we sort of look to him as if, he's going to take care of it all.
You like it when he gets it done.
Yeah, when it's on our side, it's kind of nice. I like to have somebody on my side once. But the thing that I've come to realize is that I think his style is so important for facilitating us, creating church the way church should be lived, and not getting caught in what this one man says. And so what we know is women in the United States and around the world use contraceptives. We know how to do it. We've taken care of that. That's like a non-issue. That we, the people, the edge is on leading worship. But more and more women I know are leading worship. And from my perspective, I believe people are called to a variety of kinds of ordination. And so the fact is women are being ordained by communities, not in the male model, but in a women's model to lead prayer. I know it's certainly happening in my religious community and around the country. So I think part of this is about Francis, but part of it's about us. Are we willing to take the risks and act as church?
I think
That's the question.
one thing is just, again, going back, maybe because of where we are, I think about this in terms of political leadership. What can we expect? I mean, one of the benefits and one of the accelerators of Francis's popularity was low expectations. People really didn't know what to expect.
good.
And if you look at the previous popes, you sort of know where we were going. I mean, Benedict, people say he was a nice man, is a nice man, but he was retrograde in terms of taking the church back at exactly the time it needed to confront the future. So that's just the opening that he created is measured against what it could have been, right? And he was the runner-up to Benedict. People forget that. But people didn't expect that. And I sort of think in two ways. One, in terms of presidential leadership, if you think about presidents who led, so FDR took a populace that was wholesale against any involvement in the war. As an isolationist, that was the dominant, the opinion polls at that time. And he led. He was just a bit ahead of the country. He didn't go too far ahead, but he would use that masterfully, his political calculus, to get the country where he wanted it to go. And I think of another thing, it's just in terms of Supreme Court nominations. Bill Brennan, probably the most transformative Supreme Court justice of the 20th century, was appointed because Eisenhower needed to shore up the Catholic vote, and they thought they got a nice Republican on there, and no one had any idea what he was going to do. And I think in some ways, that's what Francis has now. We don't know where he's going. We don't know where his true compass is, but we have a good sense that it's a moral compass, that he's going in the right direction, and he wants to lead it in a place that's better than it's been.
So I just want to be clear, sister. What I think you were saying is that since there are a lot of practicing Catholic women who are using birth control, that it's not as big of an issue because there are no families of 12 anymore in the pews in front of us on Sunday morning.
So we
obviously,
noticed, yeah.
I mean, is that what you're saying?
Well, I think that's a piece of it. Of course, I always have to say, ask the Catholic sister about contraceptives. It's just really, it's really ironic. But, so maybe I don't understand. But women have taken responsibility for their lives.
Right.
And found the church out of sync, out of step with what was sane.
So they're just ignoring it. They're just ignoring it.
Oh, well, but it's also, more than ignoring it, is knowing that it's the celibate boys who don't quite get it. And what could you expect?
So let's talk a little bit about divorce and remarriage. By the way, this was sort of an interesting anecdote about Tom Menino's funeral. Tom Menino, the mayor of Boston, as you know, just died recently, and his funeral was on television. And I was watching his funeral on television, and I noticed that when it came time for communion, when Secretary of State John Kerry was in the front row, and Vice President Joe Biden was in the front row, and the mayor of Boston, new mayor Marty Walsh, was in the front row, all these pro-choice, very publicly pro-choice politicians. In fact, John Kerry, who'd been told by the recently deposed Burke there, the Bishop Burke, that John Kerry shouldn't get communion because he was a divorced and remarried Catholic. Well, it was very interesting when it came time for communion. Suddenly we were not looking at the altar or at the people in the pews. We were looking at the stained glass windows. And I thought Tom Menino's family must have asked the TV stations not to show the people because they didn't want to cause a controversy. Well, in fact, it was not Tom Menino's family. It was Cardinal Sean O'Malley's Archdiocese of Boston, which if you read cruxnow.com, you would know, because I wrote about this, and when I talked to Terry Donlin, the spokesperson for the Archdiocese, he said the same thing happened at Ted Kennedy's funeral, which again was full of divorced and remarried pro-choice Catholics getting communion. So Sean O'Malley said he didn't want this to become the focus, he would have taken some heat too. So there's some self-serving thing about it too, that he was presiding at a mass or there at a mass where all these pro-choice divorced and remarried Catholics were getting communion. But I thought that was a fascinating development, that he did this himself so that you wouldn't have a big brouhaha about pro-choice, divorced and remarried politicians getting communion. So this is a long way around my getting to my next area of inquiry is, what about divorced and remarried Catholics? Now, same thing, a lot of divorced and remarried Catholics are getting communion, and their priests know they're divorced and remarried, and they go right up and get communion. But my sister's in the front row here, and we live in the Cape in the summertime, and we're at the Kennedy Library, and I have seen many times at Mass in the summer, Joe Kennedy, the former congressman, who of course is divorced and remarried, and his wife, Sheila Roush Kennedy, his first wife, wrote a book trashing the annulment process. Joe Kennedy, who's famous, stands in the back of the church with his second wife, Beth, while everybody else goes and gets communion. He never does because he's famous. If you're not famous, in many cases, you're doing this on a regular basis. So is this an issue that we might see Francis addressing or changing? I mean, we got a little bit of that in the Synod in October, but not very far.
I'd like to just speak to a larger issue that I think addresses that and addresses what Sister Simone says, which is the schizophrenia of Catholics like us in our relationship to the Pope.
Totally
So
schizophrenic.
that on a lived basis,
Medication perhaps is required.
We're practicing birth control, we're going to communion although we're divorced, we're pro-choice. On the other hand, we're all revved up about this Pope when the way that we live our lives says that the Vatican is not who defines who we are as Catholics.
Exactly.
It shouldn't be that important to us, and yet it is.
No, that's interesting.
And so that's a real schizophrenia, which is that why did I cried when I read that about the Pope. On the other hand, I'm a pro-choice, divorced person who practiced lots of different kinds of birth control, and it wasn't only condoms in 1960. Trust me on that. And so I think there's something very, very odd about the fact that emotionally we want Papa, even though we are grown-ups and we know in real life we don't need him. So I think that's very schizophrenic for the likes of us.
I think, though, that we need to flip our point of view on this, because I think that, following up on both you, Mary, and you, Sister, and actually also, Marjorie, your summary of this very concrete situation of divorce, I think what we're really seeing, and nobody in Rome is going to tell us this is what we're seeing. What we're seeing is Rome has gotten the picture.
They're woken up, yes.
And they are doing the changing.
Yes.
I think that this began with Pope Benedict. Pope Benedict's resignation is the great unaddressed mystery in this story. No, really, Pope Benedict's resignation is far more radical than anything Pope Francis will ever do. It's more radical than allowing birth control, or I would argue, ordaining women. For a pope to resign, we thought at the time maybe it's a health issue. We know by now that it wasn't a pressing health issue. He's quite lucid, he's healthy.
Some of us thought it was the Vatican Bank, but...
Well, there were scandals bubbling below the surface, but I think that what my own reading of it is, Pope Benedict understood that the church was at a critical point and a vast change, a sea change, was required. And he couldn't do it. I also think the cardinals knew that. And I think that they knew something or sensed something in Francis. And what Francis quickly got was, we can no longer stop pretending the Catholic people have left us behind on any number of issues. And this is the way change happens, I think. This is a grassroots revolution. And all you can hope for with a grassroots revolution is an authority structure that can adjust itself to it. And I think this is what that looks like.
Right, and an important piece about that grassroots is knowing that the grass is different all over the globe. And so being able to be a pastoral person who has room for everyone
Yes.
in this extremely diverse globe of ours. And when he speaks about immigration, it's so great because he says, I think I'm the only leader who doesn't have any boundaries.
Yeah.
I have no limits to who I care about. And so his perspective of immigration is as the whole. And that sense of the whole then allows much more for that welcome and much less about European colonial
Yes.
continuation of domination.
Yes.
I think that, again, what he's maybe starting with is looking at the places, the divide that he is most animated about is rich and poor. I mean,
Yeah.
I think it's fairly clear about that. And so, and that comes from a South American sort of viewpoint that he's coming about. And I think for much of the recent decades, there's been a sense of Rome that we can write off, we've lost America and we can write off America because they're not coming back. There are people like you who sort of have said, this is what we need to do before we'll even entertain it, and they weren't going to do that. But that this issue of rich and poor could be an opening because it does go back to the roots of Christianity. It goes back, that's the radical root of the roots of Christianity, and so maybe that's where he's starting.
And he's even gotten Paul Ryan talking about it. So, I mean, it has been having an impact that is making change in the political reality in our country. Now, Paul's answers so far are, he hasn't quite gotten it, but at least he's talking
But
about
here's
it.
the other thing. He uses the word poor a lot.
Yep.
No American politicians use the word poor anymore. They don't. They use middle class. And as I said in that piece, it's almost like they're afraid to use the word poor because they'll get some focus group zapper that will use that because middle class, working class has been test marketed for consumption about that, and poor doesn't because for whatever reason, he does that, and he's radical in that way of sort of bringing that issue back and going back to Europe and saying about these issues as well.
Well, you know, I was going to wait till later to talk about politics, but since you just brought up Paul Ryan, who of
How
course
could
was
I
the
know?
vice presidential candidate last time around with Mitt Romney, I do wonder what you think about the impact of the Pope, not to be so United States centric, but you know, we are in the United States. What you think might happen, if anything, with the 2016 election, because you have a lot of people that are talked about as contenders for the Republican nomination. Paul Ryan, he's not at the top of anybody's list right now, but things could change. Chris Christie is a Catholic. He's, you know, back and forth up there at the top. Jeb Bush is a Catholic. Bobby Jindal is a Catholic convert. I mean, you wonder whether some of these issues that the Pope talks about, the inequality issue, immigration issue, global climate change issues. You know, when the last time around 2012, it was fascinating how many, particularly Paul Ryan and Rick Santorum, wore their Catholicism on their sleeve, and that was their say, well, I'm doing this because of my Catholic beliefs. Well, now things have not really changed doctrinally, but they've changed at least in tone. So, what does this mean for 2016? Do you think?
Well, I remember when Pope Paul VI came to the United Nations in 1965. Popes weren't political. And President Johnson was led mostly by Cardinal Spellman of New York, to expect that the Pope was going to give a speech that would be included a resounding denunciation of communism. Spellman was under that impression because he had provided a speech. And Johnson looked forward to the Pope's speech at the United Nations as a kind of moment of triumph. Why? Because in October of 1965, Johnson's war in Vietnam was 6 months old. We had launched Operation Rolling Thunder in February. And he could already see the clouds gathering of major opposition to this war, and he was afraid of it. Some of you may remember what Pope Paul VI said at the United Nations. It wasn't Spellman's speech. It was a speech that climaxed with a resounding, passionate cry. No more war in French, help me. Lexa, help
En
me.
español podemos
There,
hacerlo.
that's all I
Yeah.
know.
Je me play, say it? Yeah. Well, it climaxed with this wonderful, repeated, resounding, no more war, war never again. We're in the thick of a savage war. The people, the General Assembly leapt to their feet. I mean, it was an unbelievable moment. It was the beginning, in real terms, of the Catholic wing of the peace movement. It was a summons by the Pope to oppose the war in Vietnam. Popes have political power. Pope Francis is addressing the United Nations next September. What war will the United States of America be waging at that point?
Too many.
And what will Pope Francis's message about it be? That's a bigger question for me than the Catholic candidates for president, actually.
But I think your point is so important, Jim, that the moral standard and the capacity to cut through the soundbite and the tested message is critical to talk about the heart of the moral stance. And it's true with income inequality, it's true with war and violence, it's true with gun violence in our nation, it's true on so many levels that capacity to speak truth that is readily identified when spoken is what's needed. And to cut through the political gamesmanship. And that is where I think our nation is so hungry, and even our politicians are hungry for that. Good point.
Either of you want to weigh in on that?
I would just say, to Tom's point, I mean, we talked about John F. Kennedy as the Catholic. There hasn't been another Catholic president since then, right?
Right.
So,
That's right.
I mean, people talk about that as a big
Vice president. President.
milestone that was going to usher in something different. And maybe it has. We dealt with it a lot with Mitt Romney as the, as the potential first Mormon president. But there's something interesting in that. There have been a lot of Catholics who have run for president who haven't been. I don't know that that's a factor on there, or it's just a curiosity.
John Kerry would have been president if it weren't for the conservative Catholic bishops who fed into the culture war
Amen.
against him. And the Catholic alliance with the Republican Party that year was pivotal in the defeat of John Kerry.
But do you know what that defeat then resulted in? That was when I came to Washington, and the day before the November election, I started my job at Network. But as a direct result of that, then those of us who have a more progressive voice got engaged in developing a network of opportunity and ways of getting into the press so that Catholic was not equated with that conservative message. And it's taken time, but that change is beginning to happen.
And we should acknowledge, sister, shouldn't we? I mean, you probably don't want me to, but in the American political system, Obamacare would have been defeated if the nuns on the bus hadn't given cover to Catholic legislators who could have voted for it.
I don't mind you mentioning it. Actually,
Did I do that okay? Was that all right?
You did great. You did great. But I really felt like it was, since we're Catholic, that nunc dimittis moment where I thought if I never did another thing, writing the letter that the Catholic sisters signed was made my life worth a worthy contribution on this planet. So it was a humbling, terribly important thing. But now we're wrestling with the implementation and improvement, because not everybody has access to health care, and that still is anguish in the richest nation on earth.
Yeah.
But it's a huge step forward.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One of the things that's humiliating to me is that the most backward-looking people on the Supreme Court are all Catholic.
That's right.
Well, just about everybody on the Supreme Court is Catholic, forward-looking and backward-looking. It's really,
Well, Sonia Sotomayor is Catholic, so thank goodness. But
and Elena Kagan.
she's not Catholic.
Her mother was. That was.
But some of the people in the world that are most responsible for some of the worst aspects of American life are Catholic, and that's pretty humiliating. And so I don't know who they were listening to, but I think your point that Kerry was defeated by,
Catholic culture.
yeah. But also, when you think about it, some of the staunchest pro-Vietnam people, like our parents, were Catholics in the 60s.
Yeah.
And so I'm not sure that what Pope Paul said spoke to people who would not have otherwise have been ready for it.
But this could be an example of, this is the challenge of Francis. He has people, there are people who are impatient with him on the left. There are people who are impatient with him and suspicious of him on the right. People probably who subscribe to the thinking of the Supreme Court justices who are Catholic that you referred to. He's got to bring that's leadership. He's got to bring that disparate, diverse, very tumultuous group and get them somewhere and not get so waylaid in those hot button issues that nothing can happen. And that's, I think, what he has tried to do. That, I think, is his approach. We don't know, but my speculation is let's put the hot button issues aside for a minute. Not aside forever, but let's put those aside and let's see if we can find some areas where we talk about whether it's rich and poor, whether it's basic immigration or decent human rights or other things. Immigration is obviously another hot button issue, but and let's kind of move that way. I don't know if that's going to happen, but I think that's the approach.
Well, back to your good question about 1916. Actually,
Right.
Pope Francis has already effectively removed Catholics from the culture war in America. The culture war has been paralyzing our country, and it's been largely Catholic, and the Supreme Court Catholics are mostly represent that. But that's over. That's the power of who am I to judge?
Yeah.
And that was about gay people, which was, for so long the center of the culture war, the main button that was being pushed, gay marriage. Of course, we all in this state can be so proud of Margaret Marshall, who initiated this fantastic next chapter in the civil rights movement. But that's Catholic politicians on the right can no longer claim their Catholic identity as a powerful part of their political argument because the Pope is not there. And that is transforming. And that even goes to abortion, which is not the same as a moral issue for the Catholic Church. But the Pope has said again and again and again, these questions, including abortion, he hasn't been explicit, but it's clearly his meaning, must not be the defining note about the Church's life in the world.
And you know what I also wonder about? I was looking before for this headline, and I finally found it. Simone Campbell, a piece that you wrote, the headline was U.S. Bishops More Conservative Than the Pope. And many people have said that the culture warrior bishops were card-carrying members of the Republican Party, and they were much more conservative. But you've seen already changes in the people that the Pope has appointed to be cardinals. He's going to appoint many more. In February, we don't know if it's 10 or 12 or maybe more. It would seem, I mean, I know you're yes, but, and maybe I'm being too yes, but it would seem as though he's moving to appoint people that are less culture warrior. I mean, I find it fascinating that Cardinal Dolan in New York City, who is a very political guy, he could be running for office if he weren't a cardinal himself, seems to have done almost a 180 from where he was before as a culture warrior to much different now. And you hear Sean O'Malley on 60 Minutes saying things like, well, if I were starting the church, I would have made women priests, and that the investigation of the nuns is a disaster. So I don't think he would have said that, I could be wrong, pre-Francis. So you wonder whether these new appointments will make a kind of kindler, gentler hierarchy at the cardinal and bishop level, which could change things.
Well, when you see the appointment of Supich in Chicago,
Yes.
I mean, that was a huge indicator. But I think we also have to be really clear that we have a very limited pool of folks who are on the leadership track who share these qualities right now in our nation, because those who were favored in seminaries for a very long period of time have been the climber types who are more interested in the rules and in the old-fashioned calling Pope Benedict the old-fashioned style, the pre-Francis style. So I think yes, some significant work can be done, but since we're Catholics here, can I go to confession though? I have to confess that in some ways it's easier for me to deal with someone like Chaput, the Archbishop in Philadelphia, who is again raising the Fortnight for Freedom, and they're going to have one next year, and he's still doing the culture war. It's easier for me to deal with his consistency than to deal with Dolan's going in the wind.
Well, I think what you look at is, has Francis given O'Malley permission to say more what he was thinking, and has Francis inspired Dolan to say something that he's not thinking? I mean, I think that might be...
I don't know.
That's perfect. That is perfect.
I don't know. And the bishop in Rhode Island is also sticking by his very conservative guns there. So I don't know. What do you think, Mr. Carroll?
It takes a long time to change an institution like this because it's made up of human beings. And these are all human beings.
The problem.
These are all human beings.
Well,
These are all human beings who have to be dealt with
Yes.
in ways that make quick and efficient change difficult.
Impossible.
But it still happens. It still happens. The analogy that has instructed me for a long time about the Catholic Church is the Soviet Union. I used to pray for a Pope John the 23rd, then I started praying for a Mikhail Gorbachev. Because what we need is somebody like Gorbachev who can preside over the dissolution of a dead authoritarian structure. And that's what the church built for itself. It was a tragic, tragic mistake going back more than 100 years.
But after Gorbachev, we have Putin, so...
I love this line. I copied it down that James Carroll describing the Vatican bureaucracy, the iron triangle of bureaucracy, dogma, and male power. I thought that was very, very good. But a couple of things I want to make sure I get to before we run out of time here and open the floor to questions. On Tuesday, this long-awaited report on women religious is going to be released, not the one about the Leadership Conference of Women Religious, I guess that's later, but the one about all the
visitation.
Exactly. And so you are, of course, a member of the Women Religious yourself, sister. So what are you hoping is going to be released on Tuesday? I mean, many people have, of course, criticized the Pope for not calling off what Cardinal O'Malley called this disastrous inquisition.
Right.
Or
Okay, people have to remember that there are two things. One is the censure of the Leadership Conference of Women Religious for doctrinal errors, and done by the group that is responsible for seminaries, not responsible for religious life. And the last time I checked, the Leadership Conference of Women Religious is an association. It is not a seminary. Not that I have any feelings on this subject, but the second one was the visitation, and the visitation got started first, and that was every religious institute in the United States was visited in some fashion. They're releasing this. They're releasing that report, so it's about each of our communal lives. So there's a lot of concern about this. But what is being done is it's being done at a press conference. It's being done at an advertised press conference where all the leaders of the LCWR have been invited. The leaders of women's congregations in Rome that have participated have been invited. It is a big hoopla that they're doing. So we take from that it's going to be mostly a positive thing, because when they did the negative censure, all they did was give it to the sisters when they showed up at a meeting, the Leadership Conference of Women Religious, and then had the U.S. bishops post it on their website immediately. So that rather undercover way of doing the censure is the antithesis of what they're doing with this. So we believe that it will be more positive in summary about what our life is like, and hopefully there will be some understanding of U.S. culture in the process. Because Sister Sharon Holland, who's now the president of LCWR, worked in Rome for many years as a canon lawyer, and she said she spent most of her time trying to explain U.S. culture to those in Rome, because they just don't get who we are. And so that piece hopefully will work out. We'll see. They're going to put it up on YouTube, and those of us that are part of LCWR are going to be able to watch it at, what did I figure out? 6:30 in the morning on the morning of the 16th. 5:30 or 6:30, I forget. But anyway.
Like a royal wedding, sort of.
Sort of like a royal wedding. We'll see. We'll see.
Well, I mean, let's hope that the self-destructive actions like that, we can move beyond that. That would be a good sign.
Oh, but here's the thing. It was self-destructive. It was ridiculous. But the Holy Spirit, in my view, the Holy Spirit used that oppression to liberate an energy in our nation that was way beyond anything else. And so Nuns on the Bus never would have happened if our little organization hadn't been named in the censure. And the fact is that freedom, it was like, we were careful about doing things as Catholic sisters because what if the Rome got upset? Well, Rome got upset and the world didn't end. And so, we no longer have that timidity. I mean,
Rome got set and the world got better.
The world got better, yes. No, seriously, it is a movement of the Spirit that freed us from that fear. And so it's not all bad.
And I think, interestingly, everyone was surprised at the depth of feeling that
Absolutely.
Americans showed in support for American sisters.
Absolutely. It was humbling.
Because, we were so tired of the Sister Mary Ignatius and the Sister Act, and, oh, you went to Catholic school, you must have been hit on the knuckles with rulers. And
You weren't?
I wasn't.
Mary, I had you figured for one of those.
I was. Yeah. But other stuff too. But what was really astonishing was that it brought to a larger population the kind of work in social justice
Yes.
that American sisters had been doing. And it really, again, tonally, did so much to change who people thought American sisters were.
Absolutely.
It was really extraordinary.
Absolutely.
I think when I would need a reminder of what it's about, that there were two places I would go. One is, as Tom said, with my father in the food pantry, handing out things, and humanity, not handing out surplus cheese, but making connections with people and bringing candy in from home for the kids in the line. And the other place was the sisters. They're at Casterly House here in Roslindale, teaching ESL to immigrants, homework, citizenship, irrespective of anyone's religious background on there. That walking the walk, that was the place that you would see that. That was the antidote to all the other nonsense, in a way. That was the crystallizing, what is this about? Right. And that was what was so self-destructive about it, is because this is what we're doing. We're going after that, and there's so much in the world to work on. So I'm glad that it had a good empowering effect.
And for me, because most of my life is not in a Catholic context. Most of my life is people who take 90 IQ points off me because I say I'm Catholic. So there was another way of being Catholic.
Yes.
Suddenly in the larger public imagination, which is what you guys did and Pope Francis did. And that's enormous. I'm just so tired of saying, I'm Catholic, but I don't move my lips when I read. And that was huge. And I think Francis is doing that. What it will lead to, I don't know, because I don't know what the church is. It is the Church of Rome, and as Europe becomes less central to the world, both economically and culturally, I don't know what the church is going to be in 10 or 20 years, or 50 years. I just don't know. And I don't know what this model of a central authority housed in a small country in the middle of a small continent. I don't know what it's going to mean in 50 years. I think that's really up for grabs.
Good question.
Well, it's time to go for questions from the audience, but I'm going to take my moderator's prerogative here to ask one more question because I haven't gotten through most of my questions, but this one I really want to get an opinion on, and then we'll turn it over to you guys for questions. Pope Francis is not a young man. We all remember the excitement, or I certainly remember the excitement of Vatican II, and then it kind of shut right down shortly thereafter. I think a lot of Catholics that are very excited about Francis and very excited about changes, or at least the tone changes, the lack of the constant feeling of judgment, are really worried that, well, I hope he lives for a long time, but if he's gone in 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, you know what I mean? Is this, we're just going to go right back to where we were? You're shaking your head no. Why not?
I don't think it's possible. I think they could, some could try, but I think the freedom of acknowledging each of our journeys as being valuable and treasured, and that the role of the papacy is not to be the great judge, but rather to be the nourisher. I think that changes our heart. And if our hearts are changed, then our leaders have to be different.
I think that the issue is the way in which the Catholic people will relate to the authority structure of the Church rooted in the Vatican. To elaborate what I started to say before, I think this is what we're seeing is the authority figures trying to catch up to the Catholic people. And I think if Pope Francis were to be succeeded by someone who did a version of what Paul VI did in 1968, it would seal the independence of the Catholic people from their authority structure.
Yeah, that's a good
The
point.
single largest denomination in the United States
Right.
is Roman Catholic.
The
The
second
second
is
largest
former.
denomination in the United States is former Catholics. And former Catholics are still in some way a part of this 2,000-year-long journey. And if somehow the Vatican stupidly and self-destructively shut down what Francis has begun, I don't think they could do it either. But if they did, the Catholic people will go on, and the Church, as you put it, will be inventing itself anew in some way. Maybe in a post-denominational way that would be very much truer to the spirit of Jesus Christ. That's actually the point. It isn't how we measure ourselves against Rome, it's how we measure ourselves against the memory of Jesus Christ. And
Amen.
and it's I think that the cardinals and the people in the Vatican get it. They better not blow this because the Catholic people, as women have shown, will go their own way in various ways. And that's a powerful act of prophetic witness to the truth of the gospel.
Amen.
Okay, we're ready to open the floor to questions, and I'm hoping there'll be a lot of questions. We have until 7:45, so we'll try to get as many as we can before then. Yes.
Thanks. Thanks so much for great food for wisdom. I was thinking about President Kennedy's address about civil rights, where he said it was a moral issue. And just yesterday, Pope Francis talked about climate change in those, at that realm. And not only because, the fact that we're not dealing with it very quickly is going to bring an unprecedented devastation, but also that the first victims are those who are, have the least and also have contributed least to, this situation we've gotten ourselves into. Do you think that message that Pope Francis sent out will permeate the pews of the United States and other countries? And also, if you have any advice for people like me who would like to see that happen, I would appreciate that as well.
Pope Francis is coming out with an encyclical on the environment, and I believe the last I heard was March. Now, this is an area where I think in our political reality, I think what we need to do is absorb that and share that with all of our politicians, because as I understand what's coming, it is a significant effort to raise up as the moral issue, the moral stance with regards to the environment, and for some of our politicians who deny that even it's an issue, I think it's going to be a wake-up call and a good opportunity. So I do expect to hear more about that. We're just going to have to absorb it and hand it out. I say I've become sort of like a Jehovah's Witness because I pass out his stuff all the time. Force it on people. I force it on people. But it's great. What he's doing is fabulous.
Anybody else, or is that, oh, this gentleman here, thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to address Mary Gordon's comment that the church is schizophrenic. I agree. And I'm a yes, but Catholic as well. For those of us that lived in this area when Cardinal Bernard Law was in charge of the Boston Archdiocese, and we went through the pain and horror of pedophilia. And Cardinal Law moved, he was effectively a superintendent of schools as well, moved a priest named Father Gagan, I believe, to 20 different schools, even though he was accused of pedophilia. Had Bernie Law been the superintendent of Boston schools, after the first school he relocated a sexually offending priest to, the Boston superintendent of schools would have been hit with criminal charges and wound up in the state penitentiary. Bernie Law got away with that for a long time. When Martha Coakley refused to bring charges against him, but had the Massachusetts State Police show up at the Chancellery.
It's Thomas Riley. Tom Riley.
Okay. Was it? I thought Martha Coakley, well, Tom Riley. Anyway, they didn't bring charges. The Massachusetts State Police showed up at the Chancellery in Brighton to question Bernie Law. He was already at Logan Airport on a flight to Rome. As far as I know, he has a cushy job in Rome. And as a Catholic, it's embarrassing to me that he's still in Rome, cushy position, and was never criminally charged. I agree for those children, and I'd like your, as prominent writers, and Sister Campbell, your reaction. Bernie Law, in my attitude, should be in a state penitentiary right now, because it's embarrassing and painful that a leading Catholic is over in Rome laughing at the American justice system because we didn't dare to do anything about his crimes.
Thank you.
Pope Francis would do a great service, not just to justice in the abstract, but to the suffering of the victims and their families if he removed Cardinal Law from his position as the rector of the Basilica of St. Mary Major in Rome, which is, as you indicate, is a position of prestige and power. And I completely agree with you. He's emeritus. He's emeritus. He still has the dignified title of rector emeritus. He shouldn't have it. Cardinal Law should be publicly disciplined for his terrible failures in this city.
But it's also about the anguish. How do we, as people, I mean, we can punish Law, and I would agree that it's about time. But the fact is the anguish that has been caused in so many settings over the last, I don't know how many years, with the pedophilia, with abuse, with some other horrible situations I know of that involved women I know in situations that were criminal or exploitative, has created anguish in our people, in us, in my heart. And unless we have some method of coming together and touching the anguish so it can be released, we are going to keep tripping over it. And so while, yes, he needs to be punished, yes, something needs to be done, we also need to find a way to healing. And just having something done unto him is not going to create full healing unless we do our work somehow together to be a community that cares for each other.
Cardinal Law was the embodiment of everything that was wrong with the Vatican. I mean, he, the arrogance, the putting the views and the perceptions about the Church and the Vatican specifically ahead of the well-being of the youngest, most vulnerable members of the flock is unforgivable. But it is that, I think, that embodiment of what Francis is trying to combat, which may be, again, among the most radical things he's doing, the culture of princes, the sort of careerism, the cancer of careerism, he called it as well, too. And I think, again, why he is persuasive on this is he admits he made those mistakes when he was in Argentina, sort of trying to please the people above him. And he's been honest about that to a surprising degree that I think gives you the sense that this isn't lip service. So we'll see what happens on that. But I think that Law, because he is such a symbol of everything that was wrong in the whacked priority schedule.
But then there is Finn in Kansas City, who is under investigation, and there is being pursued, so that there is the beginning of a Vatican-sponsored investigation, finally, into his being.
O'Malley also said, which kind of surprised me, that he had to go, that the Vatican should get him out of there, and I thought that that was an unusually outspoken remark by a sitting cardinal, so we'll see what happens. You probably all know about this, but if you don't, bishopaccountability.org is a great website that talks about all the bishops that have not been dealt with, that were aiding and abetting priests all across the country, the world, actually.
Yeah.
It's a great website, bishopaccountability.org. Yes, sir.
Good evening. Appreciate the conversation. There's one area I think we haven't really talked about, collegiality. If anything has changed, if we've had a problem in the church, is centrality. And it's been to the maximum for the last 40 years. You know, when we just didn't think we could get over that. What has changed, apparently, is that some cardinals thought, really, there's something else going on in the church. It's going on in Latin America, it's going on in the Far East, and there's a lot of energy there. Not necessarily in the United States, not necessarily in Europe, and it's a collegial question, do you let go? And it is apparent that he has let go, that he is encouraging that kind of Episcopal association which can listen. He's a pastoral guy.
Yeah.
His emphasis, listen to the people. So he's putting the listening at a different place. We had that for a couple of decades after the Vatican Council. It looks like we're going to try it again. I would like your comments on it.
Thank you.
Pope Francis is presiding right now over a profoundly promising collegial process, which began in the fall, the Synod on the Family, about which there's been some disappointment because of various aspects of it. Mary was properly critical of the commission that was appointed to be at the center of it. Nevertheless, I think there's a real promise here. It's a 2-session process. There's going to be a second session next year. There was a first preliminary report that was much debated in public in the fall. There was a question about whether conservatives influenced the final draft of that report too much. But the revolution that was already taking place is you had bishops in public disputing with each other on questions about family morality, which include contraception, divorce and remarriage, the place of women in the church. And we already see that the old idea that you only have one position in the Catholic Church is gone. There was a public dispute among bishops. And it's very clear that there's a process going on now that if the bishops do what the Pope has told them, and he can't force it, they're going to be going back to the parish level and the grassroots and getting more input on this synod on the family that will then climax next year. And at the end of it, they'll present a report to the Pope for action. And the Pope's action can be whatever the Pope wants it to be.
Exactly.
But it will have been a collegial process. And I think this, if you're imagining change on some of these basic questions of sexual and personal morality, this is how that kind of change could take place.
And they just sent out a whole nother questionnaire
Yes.
to begin the dialogue process all over the world
Yes.
in dioceses. Now, the problem was with that first questionnaire is most of the bishops in the United States didn't share it with their people in their diocese. That seemed to be trouble. Whereas most of the other places in the world, I understand, it was shared broadly, and many small group discussions were held around it. But with the new questionnaire, I think this is something that we can all encourage, is that we, the people, get involved in having conversations around this. Let's claim it.
One of the things I've just mentioned that people forget, Voice of the Faithful, the organization that grew out of the clergy sex abuse crisis, one of its big tenets was eradicating clericalism, this idea that that the priests were somehow on a pedestal and they were talking down to the parish. That was sort of unresolved, and it never materialized in a way that many people hoped it would. But I think, again, when you're hopeful and you look for those signs, it's that the erosion of that facade, that, you know, we're all adults, we're all human beings. This idea that some people, because they went into the seminary, are going to be telling you something, in many cases, about experiences that they don't have in their own life.
Exactly.
Telling parents and what to do on those kind of things. It's not to erode the respect of the clergy, but to get rid of the facade.
Good point.
Well, it's starting to be a pretty empty facade, because I think a larger question is, what are the next generation of priests and bishops? Who are they going to be? One of the problems with collegiality is most bishops were put in by John Paul II or Benedict. And as Sister Simone pointed out, seminary life is a John Paul II, Benedict seminary life. So with fewer and fewer priests and fewer young people wanting to enter a male celibate homophobic priesthood, I just think the whole structure of the church is going to be so up for grabs in a few years that we can't even
Isn't
really
that
imagine
exciting? Isn't it fabulous?
So maybe we're fighting over something that's going to disappear before, or be so radically transformed that the terms will be so different that we're not even ready for it.
Let us pray to the Lord.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Good evening. There's
Evening.
probably not a single person here who isn't well aware of what the church's official stance is on abortion. And there's probably not a person here who isn't aware of how the church has spoken about and in a certain way chastised Catholic politicians who are pro-choice. And I was hoping that maybe you could explain this to me, because I find this confusing when you compare it to the issue of the death penalty. To my knowledge, Roman Catholics are not supposed to do anything or have anything or play any part in execution. And maybe I'm wrong about that, but I thought that that was the rule, I'll call it. But yet I've never heard any hierarchy member of the Roman Catholic Church chastise politicians who were former district attorneys or assistant district attorneys or judges or governors or any other elected officials that have presided upon and enforced a death penalty. So I was just curious, am I wrong about this? Is it okay to be Catholic and kill someone by virtue of your jury verdict, or is that not okay? And I'm just curious if what I've been thinking all these years is right or wrong, and if anyone knows.
Anyone like to take that one?
You're absolutely right. And the dignity of all human life is at the heart of our Christian faith. And we're That's right. The politicization of the abortion issue is the problem in our nation, where the bishops identified politically, and that political identification then got them saying things like, well, you know, the fetus, or the at conception, then this is the most vulnerable, and they made all of these little dancing around why abortion was worse than capital punishment. Well, the fact is, it's not. But we haven't had much leadership on it.
Nor have former Nazis been denied communion. A lot of people who've done really appalling things have not been publicly censured. It's a real phobia. It's about the control of women. So I think the point is simply, where does your energy go? Your energy goes to the issue that is most at the heart of controlling women. It's very much of a piece.
I think we have time for one more question. I'm sorry to everyone else. Yes, sir.
I have a question. You were talking a lot about change and how it's going to take a while. I was wondering if you thought if younger people were able to be a part in leadership roles in politics and maybe even in the church, if that change would happen faster.
You got to.
Amen.
We've messed up, so you better do better than us.
Well, no. I mean, part of that's true, Mary. I'm with you, but there's a really important piece that Walter Brueggemann, who is a scripture scholar, says that the community that nurtures a prophetic imagination, that can touch the anguish and liberate hope into any society, requires effective discourse across generations, because we really need to hear the variety of perspectives. And younger folks, I know at Network, we're so blessed, that's my organization, we're so blessed to have a whole cadre of young folks who come for a year to learn faith and politics and the intersection of this work. And we are so blessed with the enthusiasm, the insight, the new perspectives that they bring, that it's essential for moving forward. But we also need us older folks who, kind of can say, well, I don't know. I remember back when Paul VI came to the UN and said this thing in French, which I didn't know he spoke French. But anyway,
I just don't remember the French.
I know, that's the problem. It's the details that get us. But we need our experience and insight. But we need the idealism, the enthusiasm, and the willingness to risk that youth brings. But we need to do it together. And so I think the biggest hunger right now in our nation is for community, that we create community where all are welcome and we can create this future together. But youth is essential to move us out of the doldrums. We need you.
Other thing, I teach young people, and I'm the mother of two young people, and one of the things that makes them feel that the church is irrelevant to them are particularly these sexual phobias. Yeah. That my kids say, I will not be part of a sexist, homophobic church. I just won't do it. So I think that some of the best and the brightest feel that the church is irrelevant to them because it is so far from their beliefs and what they believe is common sense. So that concerns me.
I think the promise of Francis, and it's not a guarantee by any means, but the promise of Francis is he's connecting right now with young people and old people. The women in the 8 o'clock Mass, who he's given permission to why they're still there. But the young people, I mean, look, anytime Francis does anything, my Facebook and Twitter feed blow up with young people posting about it. That never happened with Benedict, I assure you of that. So I don't know what that means. It's not to be glib about that, because there's substantial work that has to be done, but he's created an opening for young people, and if he's smart, he'll listen to young people as well as old people.
Amen. And one more piece about that, because Mary, all of a sudden it struck me that I think that the issues of the sexual issues that have been focused obsessively on women's bodies they just have to die. They just have to go away. And the return to the gospel as being the source of our nourishment, concern, and who we're called to emulate, which is the life of Jesus. If we go there, then there's huge meaning, there's nourishment, there's engagement for all of society. And that's, I think, the attractive piece that touches at the heart, the real heart of the story that inspires me and my life. And that inspires many. That's our hope.
We really have a minute left, and I want to be really respectful of everybody's time. So, sir, if you can ask a really short question and we can get a really quick answer in there, like in a minute's time, and then we can wrap this up.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And maybe I'll make it a benediction. When a structure collapses, the things you see are the fissures. And Jim Carroll had it right. It goes back to Humanae Vitae. And the false pretense there is the doctrine of infallibility. Infallibility was proclaimed, not invented. Infallibility came from the center of the church. And what I want to say is the center of the church wants it back.
Yeah?
But they can't have it.
What I love most about the First Vatican Council's declaration of the doctrine of infallibility, it was telling us that the Pope is the supreme teaching authority in the church. How do we know that? A council told us. A council can tell us something else. So there are built-in contradictions in this authority structure. And in a way, that's the hope of it to me, because it's a constant reminder. And for me, the great sin the church commits is it forgets that it's human.
Amen.
And pretends that it's above the human condition. And the great thing about these contradictions, and even the contradictions that bother us about Pope Francis, is it's a constant reminder that we're talking about a human, profoundly human institution, which is not the problem. That's the glory of it.
Amen.
Because the thing we believe is that the Holy One, however defined, is present in human beings and in human institutions. What's good news if that isn't good news?
I want to thank James Carroll. I want to thank Mary Gordon, Neil Swidey, Simone Campbell. I want to thank all of you for taking the time on this not very nice night and all this traffic to come out here to the John F. Kennedy Library. I'm going to give a shameless plug now to the Boston Globe's new website, cruxnow.com. That's cruxnow.com. Please take a look at it, and thank you very much for coming tonight.